Which country in the world today is the largest exporter of coffee? That question and many more is discussed in this book. This is a book about global trade, about how various goods have been traded across the globe since the year 1400s. The two authors, Kenneth Pomeranz and Topik, shine a light and look specifically at sugar, for example, tea, coffee, as well as gold, silver, various dyes, salt, many other commodities, and they look at these trades and these trade networks between countries and how they shaped the modern world and how they led to various conflicts and globalization, generally speaking. So the book is really helpful if you want to learn more about trade, because we tend to think of trade as something that has happened recently, and to some extent that is true. The scale of global trade after the Second World War was immense, has been immense. But countries have traded goods for thousands of years. And this book goes into some detail about how the trade of various goods shapes politics in various parts of the world. So going back to the first question, Brazil is the largest exporter of coffee in the world today. It's believed that around a third of all the coffee in the world is produced and exported by Brazil, from Brazil. But coffee doesn't originally come from Brazil. It comes from Ethiopia. There is a story, a legend, it's not clear whether it's true or not, that a goat herder in Ethiopia stumbled across coffee and the effects of caffeine in the coffee by mistake. Apparently his goats ate some coffee beans and he noticed the effects. Later on, the coffee beans were ground up and boiled in water, drank, and the effects, the stimulating effects, were noticed. Coffee became quite popular in the Middle East. So from Ethiopia, Sufi monks, it's believed, drank coffee to stay awake for long periods of time, because it's helped them pray and helped them to do the various practices of their religion. So it was helpful and compatible with some of their religious practices. And so coffee spreads throughout the Middle East and was a popular beverage long before it travelled to Europe. The Ottoman Empire and the effects of the Ottoman Empire were instrumental in introducing coffee to Europe, and it was the Dutch and the Portuguese who, on a large scale, brought coffee to Europe, where in the 17th and 18th centuries, coffee shops were set up in most of the major cities and capitals of Europe. The coffee shop in Europe is an important part of European history because it was the place where intellectuals would gather and meet to discuss and debate new ideas. There's a story of how King Charles II, who was the son of King Charles I, who was executed after losing the Civil War. King Charles II tried to ban the coffee shop, or was very hostile to them, because they were places where politics was discussed. and some politicians throughout Europe, or the political establishments, did regard the coffee shop as potentially a threat to social order, as it was then constructed. And so the coffee shop is an interesting part of European history. What happens later is that the colonial powers, particularly Spain and Portugal, set up coffee plantations in Latin America because they wanted a supply of coffee that they could control. The coffee trade was and is today, I think, something like 2 billion cups of coffee are drank every single day, which is a staggering number. 2 billion of these. That's approximately 1/3 of the entire population, all drinking a coffee every day. So coffee plantations were set up in Latin America, particularly Brazil. One of the things I learned in this book that I wasn't quite aware of was the scale of the slave trade to Latin America. When I was in school, it seemed that the slave trade only affected North America, that it was between the UK, West Africa and the United States, Northern America. But the scale of it to Latin America, really quite surprising. I think Brazil was one of the last countries to abolish slavery as well, because primarily of the coffee plantations and the importance of that to the economy of Brazil. So that's coffee. In the book, they also talk about tea. So tea, again, was something that was popular in China and East Asia generally because of its compatibility with Buddhism. It's thought that because tea, it was believed to have medicinal qualities, and certainly many people drink tea today because it helps to calm and soothe the mood. You know, I'm drinking a cup of tea. And, you know, it's a very popular drink in the world today, but it comes from China. It does grow in other countries as well, but China really was primarily the place where it grew. And, but before, so putting the tea in the bags was only something that was done in the latter part of the 19th century. For thousands of years, the tea itself, originally the tea leaves were chewed. People would chew the tea leaves, and I believe they were later eaten. But it wasn't until, I think it was the 5th century, so 400 AD roughly, you'll need to check yourself, but where people began to boil it, to mix it with water and drink it. So once again, the Dutch brought tea into Europe on a large scale from China. And also the British began to import tea. So in Britain, there was something called the East India Tea Company, and this was a multinational company that traded in various commodities. But originally in Britain, when tea first became exported, it was only really a drink for the aristocrats, for rich, posh people who drank tea, and that changed in the latter part of the 18th century. So in the latter part of the 18th century, there was a tax that was removed on tea, and this meant that the general public could afford it. Before this tax was abolished, tea was around 7 or 8 times more expensive than coffee, and so very few people drank it. But when this particular tax was taken away, tea really began to take off in the latter part of the 18th century, and this caused a problem for Great Britain, because it meant that more tea was demanded from China, but the Chinese didn't really want anything made by Britain. It didn't really have a need or a demand for any British goods. So the British were paying for all of this tea from China with silver. But over time, and particularly as the demand of tea grew, we became a nation of tea drinkers. The amount of silver leaving Britain and going to China, the British were not happy with this arrangement. They saw it as unsustainable. So what they did was the East India Company created lots of plantations, opium plantations in Bengal. So at this time, the British ruled India, and to get around this problem with the tea and the vast amounts of silver, huge trade deficits that Britain had with China, opium was exported to China against the wishes of the Chinese government, the emperor, who banned it. So opium contains the same ingredient as heroin. It is classed as a Class A drug today. It's very addictive. But Britain continued to export opium to China, and this led to approximately a third of all Chinese adults being addicted to opium. A huge problem for the Chinese emperor. 1 in 3 adults addicted to something that is a Class A drug today. So he was very unhappy with this, and he confiscated a large amount of opium and threw it into the sea, the same way the Americans threw tea, I think, into the Boston Harbour as an act of rebellion against the British. This precipitated the First Opium War between Great Britain and China. So after this conflict, it did grow as well. It wasn't just something that happened overnight, but the Royal Navy was sent in, and they completely destroyed a number of villages and towns along the Chinese coast, and the war ended quite quickly. The might of the British Navy was the best in the world at the time. I think perhaps the Dutch were on par, or if not, they weren't too far behind. But they're very powerful cannons. They went in and they, destroyed a number of villages and towns, and a number of concessions were made. So this was why Hong Kong became a British colony, or it became a part of the British Empire, because it was annexed from China as the place where Britain and the East India Company could conduct trade to China. Prior to the First Opium War, there was just one port in China, Canton, which is in southern China. All of the trade went through Canton prior to the First Opium War, and one of the reasons why the Chinese had that was because they wanted to control the flow of goods and services out and in of China. But after the First Opium War, a number of other ports were opened up. There was another conflict. There was a second Opium War in which the French got involved, I think it's one of the only times in world history when France and England were on the same side. But the French also wanted access to a larger market, and so they joined in the Second Opium War. Once again, the colonial powers won those two wars, and the 19th century in China became known as the century of humiliation. It's quite important to understand this because when we're talking about the latter part of the 19th century, we're really talking about the great-great-grandfathers of Chinese people today, and that's not very long ago. The memories of these conflicts and the devastation it would have undoubtedly have caused still lingers. And so what this book helps to do is to help one understand the perspectives and the world through the eyes of different people. The opium wars in 1840, so this was around 1840. Well, the first opium war was in 1840. I think the second one was around 1860. So that is quite an interesting part of world history. In the book, they also talk about some of the technological developments which helped to aid trade between countries. They talk about how the development of trains spanning huge distances in India. I think the first steam power train was between Darlington and Stockton in Great Britain, and that, I believe, primarily was for the transportation of coal. They talk about that and how having train lines span vast distances very much brings countries together, because prior to the trains and the train lines, different parts of the world had their own local time. But of course, if you're transporting perishable goods, food, etc., it's important to know when those goods are going to arrive. And so having a huge train line across America, for example, across India, or from northern England to London, they all have to conform to the same standards in order for those goods and services to be delivered on time and in an efficient manner. And so this has the effect of building cooperation between otherwise different peoples with different ideas, and helps to make everyone conform to, in some sense, the world economy. Once you have train stations in all different parts of the world, suddenly everyone becomes connected. And it's not only goods and services that travel around, it's ideas. And this helps to build a more globalized economy, which of course was greatly expanded in the 20th century after the Second World War. And in the book, the two authors talk about Coca-Cola and oil, how they have shaped the modern world, and the different conflicts between various interests, and how that plays out in politics. So it's a very interesting book, and it has been an eye-opener reading the book, because we use sugar, we put sugar in our tea and coffee every day. So rather than looking at history in terms of kings and countries, looking at it through these various commodities helps in a sense to bring it to life, because we all drink tea, we all drink coffee, and so it's much more relatable. So if you're looking to read a book on world trade, if you're interested in history, would be a good book to read as well if you're an investor, because having a historical perspective on trade helps to give you a better understanding of the world economy today. Yeah, would very much recommend this book. Thank you.